Team and all the wonderful things they have done. Leslie Fowler wrangled in an impressive lineup of speakers. Thank you, Leslie. We have Dave Love behind the scenes with IT, providing all of the technology needs our speakers require. And thank you to Dawn Carr, our biology teacher extraordinaire, but also hospitality coordinator. She is responsible for organizing the volunteers, setting up all of this wonderful food for you today. Thanks to her, you have your breakfast and lunch all set up for you, and you have volunteers in the hall to help you find your way throughout the presentations and throughout the day. So thank you, Dawn. And thank you to Kathleen Kearney, our assistant principal. She is instrumental in making this event happen, for being generally awesome. So, you don't know how much. Yes, so why are we here today at Festival of Ideas? What is this event? What is it all about? The purpose of Festival of Ideas and this kind of event is to help you turn learning into a hobby. Today, we are taking a classical approach to leisure by using our free time for education and enrichment, and conversations about ideas. Events like this one are designed to help you lead the good life, meaning a life inclined towards the good, the true, the perfect, the beautiful. And you will see on the back of your program, there is another event like this. We partner with Loveland Classical Schools. They have their Loveland Classical Symposium. They are always the last Saturday of January, and we are always the last Saturday of February. So you can really start your New Year's resolved towards virtue and education and that good life. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brian A. Williams. He hails to us from Eastern University in Philadelphia. He is their Dean of College of Arts and Humanities and also the Dean of their Templeton Honors College. Before going to Eastern, he was a lecturer in theology and Christian ethics at the University of Oxford. He holds a master's and doctorate degree in philosophy for Christian ethics from the University of Oxford. Dr. Williams also taught theology, philosophy, and literature at a school in Kansas. And he travels quite often to deliver lectures like the one today. He shares his insights and wisdom with academic communities all over the globe. Today he will share with us his talk titled, The Workshop of Humanity, Reading Towards Virtue. I'll leave it to him to explain. Without further ado, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Liberty Common and its faculty and staff and teachers, students, for inviting me to come hang out with you all today. This is a magnificent school. Those of you who attend here or send your kids here, I hope you know what a great gift this is, because not everyone has access to a school like this, and it's really marvelous. And I got a tour of the place today, and the more I hear about it, the more impressed I am. So thank you for having me here today. I'm also grateful to be back in the great state of Colorado. Lovely to be here. I lived in Vancouver, BC for 10 years, and when you live around mountains, they just become part of your soul. And it's like when I lived in the UK and the sun would come out, you didn't realize how much you missed it until you saw it again. So when I flew in yesterday and saw those Rockies and drove up past them, my heart relaxed. So I'm very glad to be here for a number of reasons today. Now, let me start my talk by raising a claim. Do I have more? Absolutely. Usually I don't have trouble people hearing me, but I will hold the microphone up. So let me start by raising a claim from Aristotle that some of my students find objectionable but which most educators find self-evident. Aristotle claims in multiple places that the young are not wise, and typically fail to possess the intellectual virtue of excellent practical reason, what's often called prudence, wisdom, or in Aristotle's Greek, phronesis. Now, with your house system here at Liberty Common and your character education program, I probably don't need to explain the virtues or why they're important, but when Aristotle thinks about this, he says this is problematic that youth typically find it difficult to develop prudence because they're often driven instead by their impulses and affections to make rash or unwise decisions, Aristotle says, because sometimes youth feel pleasure and pain at the wrong things. He says it's also a problem because phronesis or prudence or wisdom isn't an isolated virtue. It doesn't stand on its own. Wisdom or prudence is like that orchestra conductor or the chef improvising without a sheet of music or a recipe, deciding what needs to be done at any one moment and how loud this section needs to be or how much of this spice that we need. So prudence is always improvising because there's no script to follow. So when Aristotle reflects on this, he says, this is a problem because without prudence, you won't know how to be, for example, temperate or kind or courageous or generous in the right way, at the right time, towards the right people, even if you have the right reasons. Now, on the other hand, Aristotle thinks that the young can become skilled mathematicians. Now, not because mathematicians don't have or don't need wisdom, of course, but because mathematics doesn't require it. Right? As a theoretical science, Aristotle says mathematical proficiency can be acquired through abstract reason and instruction. So, 15-year-olds find it easier to do Euclidean geometry or determine the distance between Alpha Centauri and Wolf Star 359 than to consistently act wisely or with prudent restraint. If you've ever taught, lived with, or been a 15-year-old, and I've done all three, you know that's true. Now, when my students protest that maybe it was simply that the youth of ancient Athens and Macedonia were simply uniquely vicious people, that they were uniquely lacking in wisdom or prudence, I say, fine, you can try to make that case, but Aristotle's not alone. The Department of Motor Vehicles, the Red Lion Liquor Store, budget car rental, and the U.S. Constitution all seem to agree, I tell them, with Aristotle, that the young lack sufficient moral prudence and wisdom to be entrusted with significant moral decisions. Right? Most countries won't give you a driver's license until you're 18. Liquor store won't sell you alcohol until you're 21. Budget will make you wait until you're 23 to renew your car. And the Constitution says you have to be 35 to be president of the United States. I said, you know, if you're going to object to Aristotle, you've also got to grapple with and explain why the paradigmatic figure, the paradigmatic father of Proverbs tells his son over and over again that he needs to get the one thing he lacks, which is wisdom. I say you also have to grapple with contemporary neuroscientists, right? Because contemporary neuroscientists often call people in the ages of 16 to 25 emerging adults, because their behavior regulating prefrontal cortex, frontal lobes, frontal limbic regions, and the process of myelination won't be completed until your mid to late 20s. So there are also sociologists who use the phrase emerging adults to especially describe contemporary youth who are delaying taking on behavior regulating, or we might think of adult-making responsibilities and obligations. So it's like this group is emerging into adulthood, but aren't there yet neurochemically, physiologically, or socially. Fine. Now, if you're an emerging adult sitting here, you might take some comfort in this. Right? Because you could use the neuroscience and the sociology to totally eschew your responsibility for your actions. Right? I'm sorry, Mom, Officer, Mrs. Kearney. I simply can't control my behavior because physiologically and neurochemically I'm relying on my amygdala rather than my prefrontal cortex. You can try that. I can give you those phrases afterwards if you want to use them. And then you can let me know how it works for you. Now, not only will your argument fail to convince Mrs. Kearney for any number of reasons, it does fail to account for the complex factors that contribute to any person's moral character formation. Aristotle, sociologists, and neuroscientists, they all agree that physiological and sociological factors aren't the sole reasons that the young, or anyone else for that matter, frankly, have difficulty becoming prudent or virtuous. Neurological development is an important factor to be sure. It's worth being aware of. I certainly, once I discovered it, I certainly have much more sympathy towards my own 17-year-old self and my 17-year-old daughter, but it doesn't fully explain the issue at hand. Other factors include, 1, the desire and the effort to become wise. 2, the moral quality of one's community. 3, the people that they esteem. The virtuous and vicious exemplars that populate our imaginations. And 5, for youth in particular, their lack of sufficient experience with morally significant situations. See, unlike learning math, which only requires instruction, phronesis requires experience. And young people, by definition, have not had time to accumulate and synthesize a sufficient number of experiences to develop the prudential discrimination and virtuous affections that any given situation might require of them in the moment. They haven't had time to form what Aristotle calls habituated active conditions that act like a kind of emotional muscle memory, so that we do feel pleasure and pain at the right things and respond accordingly. That kind of thing, at least according to Aristotle, takes time, attentiveness, and sometimes the experience of witnessing wise and foolish, moral and immoral actions over many, many years, and it is often only available to the elderly. Now, because of this, Aristotle suggests that someone who lacks knowledge but has experience may be more adept at moral action than, conversely, the person who has knowledge but lacks the experience. Hence, Hamlet's gravedigger, Tolstoy's Gerasim, and many a court fool are often the wisest lot of the bunch. So, fair enough, if we accept this from Aristotle, the question you should be asking yourself is, what can we do? What can be done to overcome this experience deficit that youth have, and frankly, any of us could have? None of us are off the hook on this. Well, one 16th century educator, a German professor of Greek language and literature, has a suggestion. Read Homer. And when you're young, read fables. And when you're older, read biographies. This was a man named Philip Melanchthon, a theologian and Renaissance humanist at the University of Wittenberg in the early to mid-16th century. In his own time, he was referred to as the father of most educated men, most significant educator of the 16th century, and responsible for the educational systems across Germany and much of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. So why read Homer? Why does he suggest reading Homer to overcome the experience deficit of the young that can inhibit their formation of prudence? Well, Melanchthon is largely an Aristotelian, and so he accepts Aristotle's contention that our behavior often mirrors that of the people we associate with. Right? We're social creatures who naturally imitate each other's actions and affections. We adopt the loves, both ordered and disordered, of the communities that we're deeply embedded in. Contemporary neuroscientists sometimes speak of mirror neurons that cause us to mirror or imitate and empathize with the actions of others. It's interesting, apparently seeing somebody else perform an activity like drinking, running, or trying can activate the same cortical regions of the brain that would be activated if we were doing the activities ourselves. So Melanchthon agrees, we imitate those people around us. Melanchthon also agrees with Aristotle that virtuous active conditions are formed through experience and habits. He agrees that we require virtuous examples to follow, and that we need experience in multiple situations over many years in order to discern what the wise and prudent action would be in any given moment. We need, according to Melanchthon, what he calls forms and images of virtue that inform our emotions, our actions, and our decisions. Now, each of these elements are present in Melanchthon's claims concerning the morally formative power of Homer, and by extension, I think, any imaginative literature. So, in 1530, Melanchthon is getting ready to teach a course on Homer, and in the 16th century university, professors would often give kind of promotional lectures to an entire body of students to try to recruit them into their class. So in Melanchthon's kind of promo lecture of 1530, he says this about Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He says, these two works possess, quote, the most refined, the sweetest, and at the same time the wisest thoughts about all things and matters that can be conceived by any human mind. If Homer is excluded, Melanchthon warns, then humanity, virtue, and nobility, and all that is truly good, holy, and pious in the world is excluded. For this reason, Homer's epics are the very, quote, workshop of humanity. That's quite a claim. Right? But in the following section, I'm going to read kind of an extended quote from this speech. He defends this claim and tries to explain how he thinks the Iliad and Odyssey and other stories can aid the moral formation of any attentive reader and can be particularly useful for overcoming the experience deficit of the young that inhibits their development of wisdom and moral character. Now, this is Melanchthon. He says Homer teaches many things, admonishes wisely on many, and instills in the young the most honorable and agreeable notions of modesty, respect, and other virtues. No one is a better teacher of the habits of pleasantness and humanity, humanitas, than he. And this is what I find really interesting. He says he demonstrates and accomplishes a certain experience of life in the young, which is otherwise held in highest praise, but is attributed only to old age. Indeed, reading Homer performs this divine service, namely to impress the prudence of the old upon the youthful mind, for they can obtain and draw from this poem by a shortcut, as from a treasure or a spring, those things which old people usually learn from long experience, and which numerous years, the variety of things, and the experiences of human life teach them. For the teaching of how to live rightly and happily is not delivered less successfully there than in any writings of the philosophers. Indeed, he, Homer, envelops the most serious and holy tenets in the sweetest and most pleasant poetic images, so that noble and inquiring minds are educated with a sense of beauty. And as an aside, to educate with a sense of beauty, that ought to be the goal of every teacher, and carved above the door of every single school, to educate with a sense of beauty. But notice what he says here. Let me draw out a couple things. He says Homer educates through the beauty of his poetry by making certain actions and certain virtues attractive or agreeable, and other actions and vices repellent, so the reader's affections are drawn to imitate the former, avoid the latter, and so what he says, develop and nurture their humanitas, their humanity. For instance, Homer depicts characters displaying both respect and contempt for the elderly, betrayal and love between spouses, and murder between spouses, if you know the stories. Hospitality and inhospitality, the goodness of a well-ordered home, perseverance before adversity, respect for the gods, the dangers of arrogance, rage, and beauty, the appropriateness of lament, the importance of fathers and mothers, gratitude to benefactors, courageous decision-making, and of course grappling with death, aging, and immortality. And he does that through an array of characters, through soldiers, men, women, servants, tradesmen, goat herders, maids, beggars, kings, queens, parents, and children. Now, second, he says Homer's poems instill virtue and impress prudence by providing shortcuts to life experiences and insights that are necessary for virtue, but which are usually only available to the aged. Now, this is accomplished when readers, if you will, step out of the immediacy of their own stories and submit their hearts and minds to the immediacy of the story that they're living within. The immediacy of the narrative story and the lives of the literary characters whose virtuous and vicious decisions they experience, as it were, from the inside. So the idea is you step out of the immediacy of your world and you step into what J.R.R. Tolkien called the secondary world. And you live in the immediacy of that story, and you live with those characters, and you live with them, and you die with them, and you make foolish, and you make wise decisions. And then, when you return from the immediacy of the secondary world to the immediacy of the primary world, you draw back with you vicariously experiences. So that you've had experiences you did not have before you read that story. Those experiences are your own, and you are a different person than you were before you read the story, because their experiences are then folded like yeast and dough into your own experience. And we discover as readers that we are changed. If you read with the correct posture, we draw back these experiences, these insights, and these wisdom with us. And in doing so, Melanchthon suggests readers are potentially able to make more rapid progress toward prudent discernment and virtuous moral character. And that our affections are tutored to feel pleasure at the right things and pain at the right things. In other words, Homer gives readers what they have not earned. It's a profound insight. And any of you who are readers, who have been lifelong readers, you know that experience. Now, I don't want to overstate the claims concerning the formation of virtuous affections and prudence, of course, because, and I won't name names, we can all imagine books, movies, characters, and scenes that leave us mouth-watering, right? Feeling pleasure and pain at the wrong things. And of course, moral formation doesn't happen simply because you read Homer. And the young often need to read Homer in the right way, at the right time, and for the right reasons in order for it to be morally efficacious. And here's where they often need the pedagogical phronesis of teachers in order to develop their own moral phronesis. And nor am I implying that great literature like Homer is populated by flat caricatures of virtue and vice, like so many of the insipid children's books that my well-meaning relatives keep giving my kids. Year, God bless them. And of course, great works of literature should also be read as beautiful works of art, and cherished as artifacts of our inherited cultural endowment. We don't read them simply in order to extract a moral to apply to our lives. I mean, most of this happens in Emily Dickinson's words on the slant, not directly. However, with those caveats in place, I note that Melanchthon is not a lone voice in attesting to the morally formative power of literature. Consider the following from English professor Henry Zylstra. He says, there's a real sense in which literature enables us by vicarious experience in our life to bring to bear on being human myriads of lives not our own. By universalizing ourselves in the significant experiences of others, there is more of us that is human, that can be human, than there was before. There is more of you after reading Hardy to be human with than there was before you read him. I love that line. Let me say that again. There is more of you after reading Hardy to be human with than there was before you read him. And there's also more conviction that you want to be it. To read such a novel, he says, is to have confronted the moral issues of men, not in the skeletons of theory or the bones of principle, but in the flesh and blood of concrete experience. Frederick Buechner, a great novelist who acknowledges that literature can both form and malform us, he writes this. He says, I think of painting and music as subcutaneous arts, but writing strikes me as intravenous. He says, as you sit there only a few inches from the printed page, the words you read go directly into the bloodstream and go at it full strength. More than the painting you see or the music you hear, and my wife's a painter and my dad's a musician, so I take that, but more than the painting you see or the music you hear, the words you read become in the very act of reading them part of who you are. If there is poison in words, you're poisoned. If there is nourishment, you are nourished. If there is beauty, you are made a little more beautiful. A word doesn't merely say something, it does something. It brings something into being, it makes something happen. C.S. Lewis as well, in Experiment in Criticism, says this: "What then is the good of occupying our hearts with stories of what never happened and entering vicariously into feelings we should try to avoid having in our own person?" The nearest I've got to an answer is that we seek an enlargement of our being. We want to be more than ourselves. Each of us by nature sees the whole world from one point of view, with a perspective and a selectiveness peculiar to himself. We want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as with our own. And if you know Lewis's Narnia stories, you know he tried to model this in his Pevensey children, who were expected to still live as kings and queens once they left the uncommon world of Narnia and went back to their common life in the south of England. Though, of course, only 3 of them do that. If you know the stories, you know the oldest daughter, Susan, does not, which always makes me sad, but I think is Lewis acknowledging that this is not simply automatic. Now, Lewis may have learned this from his own master, George MacDonald, the great 19th century Scottish fantasy writer that is really the forefather of what Lewis and Tolkien both tried to do. In his amazing novel, Phantastes, his central character, Anados, returns to his own land after living for decades in fairyland. And this is how Anados explains the connection between the two at the end of Phantastes. He says, "I began the duties of my new position, somewhat instructed, I hoped, by the adventures that had befallen me in fairyland. Could I translate the experiences of my travels there into common life? This was the question. Or must I live it all over again and learn it all over again in the other forms that belong to the world of men, whose experiences yet run parallel to that of fairyland?" And he ends the book saying, "These questions I cannot answer yet." He's asking himself, can I translate into my common life the lessons I learned there, or do I have to learn them all over again for myself? And to translate one's literary experiences into one's lived experiences, that's the promise and the challenge of literature. And I think both MacDonald and Lewis learned this from Dante's comedy, which is one of the biggest influences on Lewis's writing. If you know the comedy and then you go to Lewis, you see Dante through everything he wrote. But this is Dante's explicit strategy for effecting moral change in his readers, right? And in the Purgatorio, if you know that, this is the method he depicts God and the angels explicitly using to form the virtues and reform the loves of those souls working their way up the 7-story mountain, or your staircase back in the corner. Give it Now, if you know the story, you got to recall that the souls of the proud on the first cornice spend decades and centuries meditating on stories, on historical and literary stories of virtuous and vicious characters whose stories are carved into the wall and carved into the walkway before them. And they move round and round this circle, meditating on the stories of, for example, Mary at the Annunciation, when she has her famous fiat mihi, may it be unto me, I am the Lord's servant, in this act of humility. The Emperor Trajan stopping on his way to war to hear a widow crying out for justice. King David dancing unashamedly before the ark. And there are negative examples of Lucifer and Nimrod and Arachne and others. And souls on this cornice, they meditate on these stories for centuries, decades, until they purge the vice of pride and adopt the virtue of humility that are depicted in these stories, when they become part of who they are. Now, Melanchthon, though, doesn't just suggest reading Homer. He also lauds the power of fables in Hesiod, Aesop, and Scripture to leave what he calls, and I love this phrase, spines in the mind that spur especially young readers to pursue the good. If you think of spines or spurs, maybe horse riders here, if you wear spurs, you know what spurs are there for. He says the stories of fables act like that in the minds of children. They're spines in the mind that refers to the way literature can plant inspiring and repelling models that attune the affections, motivate us to perform good actions and avoid bad ones.